All right, today we're going to dive into the world of nomadic pastoralists. These are communities whose entire lives are built around a constant journey, moving with their herds in a rhythm that's, well, sustained them for centuries.
You've probably seen this yourself, right? Maybe you're in a car and suddenly you see this river of sheep or cattle just flowing across the landscape. We see the movement, sure, but do we ever really stop and think about the story behind it? When we learn about history or economics, what do we hear about? Agriculture, industry, but the lives of pastoralists? They're usually just a footnote if they're mentioned at all. It's almost as if they're just these figures from some forgotten past. But here's the thing. Their lives absolutely matter. I mean, they represent this incredibly deep and sustainable connection to the land. So that's what we're doing in this explainer. We're bringing their incredible story right to the forefront where it belongs. Okay, so first up, a world in motion. Let's try to understand their world before everything was turned upside down. And let's be clear, this wasn't just aimless wandering. It was a seriously organized way of life. I mean, these communities had a kind of profound ecological knowledge. Think about it. They had to calculate the exact timing of their movements. They had to know exactly where to find water and pasture. And they had to build relationships with farmers all along the way. This whole life was sustained by incredibly careful consideration. This mountain cycle is a perfect example. Let's look at the Gujar Bakr walls of the Himalayas. So in the winter, you'd find them down in the low hills. But come April, whole families would pack up and band together into this big caravan, a kafala, and begin this long march north. Their destination, the high valleys of Kashmir, where the summer grasses were lush and green. And then once September rolled around, they'd start that whole journey all the way back down again. But of course, not all pastoralists live in the mountains. For a lot of them, especially on the plateaus and plains, the rhythm of life wasn't dictated by snow and cold, but by something else entirely, the monsoon. And this next example is just brilliant because it shows this perfect symbiotic relationship. Take the Dungar shepherds of Maharashtra. They'd spend the monsoon up on the central plateau. But after they harvested their crops in October, they'd march all the way to the Konkan coast. And get this, the farmers there welcomed them. Why? Well, the Dungar flocks would manure the fields, which was amazing for the soil, and they'd eat the leftover stubble. In return, the Dungars got rice to take home. It was a total win-win, a perfect exchange. And this is the key to their whole way of life. This constant movement wasn't random. It was a form of conservation. By always being on the move, they allowed the pastures to recover, to heal and regrow. It was how they made sure there would be enough grass for years and years to come. Pretty smart, right? But this ancient, sustainable way of life was about to collide, head-on, with a completely new and radically different view of the world. And that was colonial rule. The walls were about to close in. And the changes that came were, well, they were systematic and pretty devastating. Imagine this. From the colonial perspective, all those grazing lands were just waste. Land that wasn't being farmed for cash crops was seen as unproductive. So what happened? New forest acts were passed, and suddenly pastoralists were blocked from areas their herds had used for literally centuries. On top of that, nomadic people themselves were seen as suspicious. They were hard to track, hard to tax, hard to control. And to really tighten the grip, new taxes were slapped on everything. On the land, on the water, even on every single animal a herder owned. What you're seeing here is a fundamental clash of worldviews. On one side, you have the pastoralists, who see land as a shared resource for everyone's survival, and forests as vital places for their animals to eat. On the other side, you have the colonial state, which saw any uncultivated land as wasteland, and saw forests only as a source for commercially valuable timber. There was just no way these two perspectives could coexist peacefully. And listen to this quote from a British forest official back in 1913. It really says it all. He wrote that a forest used for grazing cannot be used for any other purpose and is unable to yield timber and fuel, which are the main legitimate forest produce. You see that word, legitimate? In their eyes, grazing wasn't a valid use of a forest. The only thing that mattered was cutting down trees for profit. This deep distrust of people who moved around was actually written into law. The Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 is just wild. It literally branded entire communities, not just individuals, but whole communities of pastoralists and traders, as being criminal by nature and birth. They were forced into these supervised settlements and couldn't move without a permit. The village police were tasked with keeping a constant watch on them.
It's unbelievable.
Okay, so this whole story wasn't just happening in India, not by a long shot. To really get the global scale of this disruption, we need to shift our focus to Africa, because we're going to see a strikingly parallel struggle. So Africa is home to over half of the world's entire pastoral population. That's a huge number. And communities there, like the famous Maasai cattle herders in East Africa, went through a colonial experience that is, well, it's going to sound hauntingly familiar. One of the absolute biggest blows they faced was the catastrophic loss of their traditional grazing lands. I mean, before the colonial powers showed up, Masaland was this enormous territory. But then, they lost. A staggering 60% of it. 60%. They were basically crammed into a small, dry zone with terrible pastures and really unreliable rain. It completely upended their ability to survive. So how on earth did this happen? Well, it was like a three-pronged attack on their land. First, European powers just drew a line on a map and sliced Maasai land in half between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. Then, the best, most fertile grazing lands were just taken away for white settlers. And finally, huge areas, we're talking vast tracts of land, were turned into game reserves like the Serengeti National Park, places where the Maasai were suddenly told they weren't allowed to go anymore. And this quote from herders in nearby Namibia around the same time is just heartbreaking. It captures that feeling of utter loss and confusion. They said, "We are imprisoned. We do not know why we are locked up. We are in jail. We have no place to live." It's like they were in a prison on their very own land. But here's a really important part of the story. Pastoralists were not just passive victims. They were incredibly resilient, and they found all sorts of ways to adapt and survive under these immense pressures. So how did they cope? Well, some had to reduce the number of animals they owned because there just wasn't enough pasture anymore. Others found entirely new routes. When the partition of India in 1947 blocked old paths, for example, herders like the Raikas just figured out new ways to get to grazing lands in Haryana. The economic pressure also split the communities. The richer pastoralists, well, they could afford to buy land, settle down, and switch to farming. But the poorer ones, they often had no choice but to find work as laborers in towns or on farms, many of them trying to juggle herding with other odd jobs just to make ends meet. So all of this history, this struggle, it brings us to a really crucial question about where pastoralism fits into our world today. I mean, after everything they've been through, everything we've talked about, is this way of life just doomed to disappear? Well, you might be surprised. The answer, from more and more ecologists and economists, is a firm no. Modern experts are finally starting to recognize the wisdom that these communities have held for centuries. And this is maybe the biggest takeaway from their whole story. In many of the world's dry and hilly regions, pastoralism isn't some outdated relic. It is, in fact, often the most ecologically viable and sustainable way to live on that land. So their incredible story of survival really forces us to look at our own ideas, doesn't it? It makes you question what we think of as progress, and maybe ask ourselves, how can a way of life that's thousands of years old still hold such vital lessons for our own sustainable future? That's definitely something to think about.